Serious, what is the unexplained/creepy/scary story that always gets told in your family gatherings? My grandmother is getting pretty old now, so she tells this story more often than she used to. In the 60s, she took her 3 young kids and left her abusive husband. The only house she could afford to rent at first was a ramshackle 4-room farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It didn't even have indoor plumbing, just an outhouse and a well out back where they drew water. According to her and my mother, every night around 2 a.m., they would hear the back door into the kitchen unlock and open. It was an old door, and both those actions had very distinctive, unmistakable sounds. They would then hear heavy footsteps walk across the creaky kitchen floor to the water bucket, and the water dipper would rattle against the bucket, like someone was dipping out a drink of water. And then nothing. It scared the shit out of her, of course. But once she ascertained that no one was breaking and entering, so there was no one to shoot, she settled down. In her eyes, whatever was happening, it wasn't harmful. My mom, on the other hand, was the only kid old enough to really understand what was happening, and it freaked her out, so my grandmother decided to get her sister, my great-aunt Sue, to stay over one night. They planned to sit up and see what the hell was going on. My mom wasn't going to join them, but she couldn't sleep and felt safer in the room with them, so she was there as well. When 2 o'clock rolled around, they were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when they heard the back door unlock and swing open. The thing is, they were staring straight at it, and it didn't move. Same with the footsteps and the water dipper, they saw nothing, even though they could hear it clearly, even discern the direction of the noises. That was pretty much that. It kept happening every night. They didn't stay in that house long because my grandmother found a job and a better rental closer to town, and my mom was super happy to get out of there. So my grandmother still talks about it sometimes, and it's strangely hilarious, because she's so unbothered by it. I mean, I would pee my pants. But the last time I asked her why it didn't scare her, she said, "Well shit, he was just thirsty." My grandmother always tells the story of the man in the yellow coat. He knocked on the door of her and my grandfather's home one day. They were a young couple at the time. He was European, she's not exactly sure what nationality, but he was wearing a yellow coat. Being religious and the kind of people who will always help others, they invited him in for tea, asked him about himself, etc. He wouldn't give much away. The second time he appeared unannounced at the front door, my grandparents already had friends over but invited him to stay anyway. As soon as he came into the room, everyone there started trying to find excuses to leave the room or not look this man in the eyes. One by one everyone left the room until he was the only one left there, and when they talked about it later, each person felt an indescribable fear when around this man in the yellow coat, like he had this sinister aura. From then on my grandparents tried to find excuses not to be around him, even though he continued knocking on the door from time to time for seemingly no reason. One day my grandmother collected the mail and found a handwritten letter from him saying that he was going to kill them both, my grandparents, that he would not stop even if they cried and begged him to, and how they would both burn in hell. Naturally my grandmother was terrified, and even though he never followed through on his threat, she would occasionally see him walking around town in his yellow coat and remember it all over again. I think he had probably had major issues, but the story gives me the shivers whenever someone brings it up. My dad once traveled through northern Mexico with some of his siblings and their spouses. They stopped somewhere to sleep for one night and had a terrifying encounter. I don't remember what the layout of the room was, but my dad did say that several of the beds were placed next to each other. They used those thick Mexican striped blankets due to the low temperatures up in the mountains. He woke up in the middle of the night and felt the coldest sensation he's ever experienced going down his back before one of my aunts started screaming. Someone turned on the light to find my aunt sitting up and crying in bed. There was a huge chunk of her hair missing. When they looked underneath her bed, they found her hair just lying on the floor. My dad says she was in the middle of the bed, so no one could figure out what happened until she calmed down somewhat. Apparently, she woke up and felt a big hand with long fingernails pulling on her hair. They didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, the owner asked the group if they had been by to visit the previous night. Grew up in rural Ireland, there was never a shortage of these types of stories. My dad was 18 when his father, my grandfather, got ill and became bedbound. One evening Dad was sitting with his father talking about various jobs he'd need to do on the farm. After talking for a while, my grandfather asked Dad if he wouldn't mind going out to the dairy, milking parlor, to get a bottle of Wixie he kept out there. probably hide it there from my grandmother, who was a bit too generous with the whiskey when guests came. My father went out to the dairy and was looking for the whiskey. The dairy had one little window at the back that looked out onto the farm. On the other side of the window was a pit where all the cow's shit from the winter was kept. If you stood it, you would sink immediately and suffocate to death. Anyways, as my father was looking for the whiskey, he heard 3 solid knocks on the window. Knocks heavy enough to break the window. He froze on the spot because he knew there was no way anyone could knock on that window. After a few moments he snapped out of it and realized what he had heard: death knocks from the banshee. It was a sign that someone close to you would die. He immediately ran back into the house and up to his father. He found his father dead with his 2 hands together as if he was praying. Dad believes his father knew what was happening but didn't want him in the room to experience it. Dad said he had been in a lot of pain that day. He never found that bottle of whiskey. Apparently my great-grandmother was an actual witch. When my grandfather was a young boy, my great-grandmother has had enough of my great-grandfather cheating on her. He was a merchant of some sort, going from town to town with an actual carriage, and quite the womanizer. So she cursed him. As my grandfather tells he was accompanying his dad on one of his trips. They were driving the carriage and then all of a sudden a huge creepy white figure appeared right in front of the horses and they went completely mad with fear. My grandfather said she looked like a huge white woman, completely silent, just raised her hands in front of the horses. They tripped over the whole cart. My great-grandfather was killed instantly and my grandfather broke his leg so badly the bone came through the skin and he had the scar to prove it, but was otherwise okay. My dad always jokingly tells me to make sure every guy I date knows this story so they won't mess around. This happened to my parents in 1989 while we were on our annual trip to rural Ireland. My parents had gone out for the evening and left my grandmother to babysit us. On their way back they heard a news report on the radio that spoke of a boat sinking in the River Thames after it collided with another. The report mentioned there were many casualties. My parents were quite upset about this news and wanted to find out more. How many people died? Did they save anyone? How did this crash happen? When my parents finally made it home they asked my grandmother if she had heard the news, but she told them she hadn't heard anything about the boat disaster. They spent the rest of the evening trawling radio reports and the few TV channels for any news, but to no avail. There was no further news about the disaster. This was the 1980s and up to date, 24-hour news was not a thing. So my parents assumed they would hear more in the morning papers and newscasts. The next morning, my parents drove to town to collect the morning papers hoping to find something, but again there was nothing. Maybe it happened too late last night and missed the morning papers? So my parents kept listening out for radio and TV reports throughout the day, but again nothing. My parents were incredibly confused. Had they misheard the news last night? Impossible, they thought. That night whilst watching TV, my grandmother, father and mother saw it. On the River Thames the pleasure boat, the Marchioness, had collided with the bow bell causing the former to sink and claim the lives of 51 people. For my parents they heard about the disaster the previous night, but the crash only just happened whilst they were watching TV. Marchioness disaster. One of my hobbies is genealogy. I have a personal rule that I always turn off the radio when I enter a cemetery out of respect. My wife and I were driving one day, and came upon a cemetery I was planning to visit. The cemetery was very old and decrepit. There was no way to drive into it, so I parked on the road. I told my wife I would just snap a couple of photos. I ran in, took a few pictures, and left. When I got in the car my wife was white as a sheet. She told me to get her out of there quickly. As we drove away I asked what happened. She explained that the minute I entered the cemetery the radio stopped, and the minute I exited the cemetery it went on again. We lived on a farm for a while in Ireland, well out in the middle of nowhere, just outside of Ballymahon in County Westmeath. As the story goes, a man used to come home every night to the house he lived in with his mother. He'd come down the road, come in the back door, go down the hall and into the kitchen and then pull out a chair to sit at the table and have something to eat before going to bed. From her bed, his mother heard him repeat the exact same pattern every night. The last night though, after she heard the door, the steps and the sliding chair in the kitchen, the man was found dead the next morning, hanging from a tree beside the gate to the field he would have crossed as a shortcut to the last stretch of the road to her home. The gate was left open by the way, which doesn't make sense because we all kept cattle in that field and they could have easily gotten out. The implication was that he never physically never made it home that night, but his spirit did. My grandparents moved into that house and my mom grew up there. Granny claims she heard the ghost herself a few times, but what really gets everybody upset is that to leave our farm you had to walk down that lonely road and go right past that gate, and many a time it will be open even though you knew there was no way anybody in their right mind would forget to close it behind them. The cattle did sometimes get loose, believe me. When you're a little kid, and having heard that story a few times, and having to walk down that road alone in the early hours of the morning to go check the cattle didn't wander off, you don't walk past that gate. You run like hell past it. And when you upset a resting flock of birds and they all alight, you scream for all you're worth. Granny might have been pulling our legs, I suppose, but this was Ireland around the 1920s/30s when the original events took place. They were hard, turbulent times, and she went to mass pretty much every day until she passed away in the 60s. She was as straight-laced and devout a churchgoer as you'll ever meet, and unlikely to have made a prank like this. To this day, some 50 years later, the gate is still there, and so is the tree the man hung himself from. It's an ugly old-looking thing, a perfect hanging tree, and I still get the creeps every time I go back and go past it. I never linger there. Every once in a while the cattle do still get out and block the road, so we have to go out and herd them back, but I've never told any of the kids about the story that might explain how they got out in the first place. My mom suffered a miscarriage back in 2001. My brother, who would have been named Alex, was then appointed as the protector of the house. Any dropped pan in the middle of the night, or the odd noises and anything linked to paranormal activity was attributed to Alex just making his rounds. When I was younger, I used to be terrified at the thought of meeting my ghost brother, and I still would be. But it's a cool thought to think of my little brother battling against demons, protecting his family. My dad's aunt lived in Ohio. Another generation of the family lived there before her. One of the family members killed himself in the basement many years before. One day at a get-together, one of the kids was downstairs in the basement playing, and the adults could hear him talking to someone. I'm not exactly sure how it all unfolded, but it turns out that when he was asked who he was talking to, he said the dead man's name, whom he had never met, and described him perfectly. I was only told this after I asked for my first Ouija board. My grandmother was a teenager, so this story must be late 1940s, early 50s. Anyway, her older sister borrowed a Ouija board from a girl in town. She and some of her other sisters set it up in a dark room. My grandmother was uninterested, so she took her book to the living room. A little while later her sister comes and asks her to come back to the room. My grandmother goes in and sees the other two sisters at the board. The planchette was moving, spelling out the same four-letter word. Ruth, Ruth. The older sister said that all the board had done since they set it up was ask for her. My grandmother sat down at the board and put a finger on it. The planchette began flying across the board, spelling out one word after the other. They sat there for over an hour. She never shared precisely what it told her that night, but whatever it was, the Ouija board was burned, and they never let another one in any of their houses again. There's a story about my great-grandfather. He was heading home from church one evening. He was on a cart being pulled by a horse and he was alone. As he got close to home, he noticed someone walking in an overgrown area full of weeds. He called out to the person and they stopped walking and seemed to turn to him. They began walking towards him, and as they came out of the cover he saw that they didn't have a head. His horse started to panic and he started freaking out. As he took off in the cart, the headless person started running at him and followed behind him until he was out of sight. He refused to ever go back that way again. I know I'm really late to this thread, but my great-grandma was a psychic. Not the gimmicky type either, but a real honest-to-goodness one. One of the ones that sticks out the most is when she woke up in the morning from a dead sleep, gasped, and yelled to her husband, "Turn on the radio, there was just a train crash and 30 people died." Great-grandpa turns on the radio, and at that exact moment is the announcer telling the news about the tragedy. I have a few more if anyone would like to hear them. I hope I'm not too late. My cousin Emily was born in 2000, my grandpa died in 2002. One day she was playing, 3 years old, talking on her little toy phone, and she started laughing. My aunt asked her what was so funny and she said, "Papa told me about when there was a bird in this house and he had to get it out with a broom." Which was funny because the DID happened when my grandparents stayed at her house when my aunt was in the hospital ready to deliver her. Back in the mid-1960s, 1965 if I remember the dates correctly, my papa, 18 at the time, his younger sister, Her fiancé and a friend we'll call Mike, decided to mess with the Ouija board Mike had gotten. According to my papa, no one believed in it, even though my papa's family were quite religious. They didn't believe that a spirit or demon could really manifest through a toy. They got to playing, asking the usual stuff. We all know the drill. Suddenly his sister asked, "When will I die?" And it spelled out soon. My papa didn't think it was very funny that Mike was trying to scare her. His sister egged it on, asking for different details and specifics until finally the board spelled out 19 and train. They all scoffed. There weren't any trains near their town and they left their town maybe once a year. They call it quits and forget about it. Fast forward a few months, October 19th of that year. My papa's sister was surprised by a gift from her fiancé with a trip to a large nearby city to see a show. Later that night, the police informed my papa's family that there had been an accident. The fiancé had tried to beat the train. They assumed this. There were no witnesses, but they assumed if they were stuck they would have at least tried to get out of the car, and it had been hit, killing them instantly. I found all this out for the first time when I was 6 and asked my papa if we could get a Ouija board like the one we saw on the paranormal/ghost show we were watching. Edit: this one is my Mima's grandmother, and is more explainable and weird than spooky or scary, and it's worth noting that my Mima's side of the family believe very heavily in the significance of dreams. She swears she saw my son's future before he was even conceived. When I was 18, I had just moved to a new state with my husband. She called me one day to tell me that she had had a dream the night before and she just knew she had to tell me, not why, just that she did. She dreamed that she was in a large room, almost like an auditorium or a college lecture hall, that type of thing. She looked up and there was a man on a podium, his picture light up on the wall behind him. She said he had dirty blonde hair and dark eyes. He was handsome and he was speaking, but strangely enough she couldn't hear him. Everyone else seemed to be listening intently, but no matter what, she could only hear silence. Suddenly the picture behind him changed, and it changed to the phrase "Great One," and the dream ended all at once. We disregarded it for years. Then I had my son. At 3 years old my son was not only diagnosed with nonverbal autism but also savant syndrome. His case presents his perfect memory and high IQ, estimated to be at about 130. His name means Great One. We didn't know this when we named him. Mom is from Nepal, family is Hindu. When someone dies in the family, it's customary to not celebrate or throw any parties for a month after death. One year my mom's great aunt dies. Family decides to celebrate some holiday. All the kids are in a room away from the adults watching a movie when they hear a knock on the door. They open the door and see the dead aunt just smiling at them with a creepy smile on her face, holding a glass of water. Then she just shrinks and shrinks until she disappears and the glass falls and smashes. This story is still told today, and there were like 25 eyewitnesses, some of whom are super serious people in real life who normally wouldn't make stuff like this up, so, kinda freaky. 2 stories from my mum's cousins. Mary, house in rural Ireland. Like most houses in this part of rural Ireland, Mary's house was a detached, single-story property situated on a large plot of land with a long, unlighted path up to the property. Mary's neighbors were a good 10 to 15 minutes walk away, and the nearest town was a 15-minute drive away. This alone can be unnerving to those unfamiliar with the countryside. However, this house always had an uneasy vibe about it. You could be sat in the living room watching TV and have a bizarre feeling, not necessarily someone watching you, but definitely an uneasy one. I digress. On the day in question, Mary was in the front room hoovering and cleaning. She had full view of the pathway leading from the main road up to the house. As she was working away, she noticed 2 men in suits walking up the path. A little strange as they were on foot, but Mary assumed they were relatives/visitors of a nearby neighbor. Mary went to the door to greet the men, but they were nowhere to be seen. Surely, they would have been by the door at this point, or at least walking up to the door. Strange. Mary closed the door and walked through to the back to the kitchen to see if they had come by the back door. Mary didn't have to open the door to see the 2 men walking up the hill at the back of her house. Very bizarre, seeing as they were in suits and walking towards an area that was completely deserted. Second story. My family personally experienced something strange at the same property. My parents were staying in the master bedroom at the front of the property. My grandmother was staying in the other bedroom at the front. My eldest sister was staying in a bedroom at the back with her friend, and myself and my other 2 sisters stayed in the 4th room by the kitchen. We had all been asleep for several hours when we were suddenly jolted awake by my eldest sister's screams followed by her friends. We all rushed out into the living room. All bedrooms were joined up by this room, with my dad running to my sister. She claimed that they were woken up by a tapping on their bedroom window, followed by a light from a torch beaming into their room. My father, a great beast of a man, went around the property ready to confront whoever it was. Strangely, my dad was unable to find anyone and we never experienced anything for the remainder of our stay. My dad always tells this story. He doesn't believe in ghosts or any of that, and he is not the kind of person to make things up just to scare us. Which is why this is even creepier. Some backstory: my entire family is from Mexico, and we lived there until a couple years after I was born. I'm the youngest, so at the time of the story I hadn't been born. The youngest was my brother. He was around 3. Story goes, my 2 oldest siblings, who were around 10 and 14 at the time, went camping with an aunt and cousins. Mind you, our family isn't the outdoorsy type at all, so this was a rare occurrence for my siblings. They slept in the woods, a park, for one night only, and after they came back, weird things started happening slowly. We had a pit bull puppy and 2 parakeets that were always in a cage together. The birds became aggressive towards each other, so much that my mom had to put them in separate cages. This circular burn appeared on the dog's side, kinda like if a perfect circle had been branded on him. My brother, the 3-year-old, would talk about seeing a gold elephant. A baby gold elephant. My parents have never believed in superstitions or the supernatural or any of that, so they kind of chose to ignore it. Until a friend, a lady that cleaned my paternal grandmother's house, visited them and said something was off. She said there was an extremely negative energy in the house. She asked if they had been to the woods or the forest. My parents explained that their 2 oldest children had gone camping for a night. The woman said, "They brought something back from there." A day later, the woman brought a rosary and holy water, along with a man. I don't remember if he was a shaman or a curandero. It's been a while since my dad told me the story. The man told my parents to get a small bowl and some alcohol, isopropyl. They put the bowl on the ground, poured the alcohol in it and lit it, waiting in the living room as instructed, while the man and the woman went all around the house, blessing it. My dad tells me that when they'd get to certain places in the house, where the birds were kept on the patio, my brother's bedroom, the small fire would shoot up like 2 feet. The bowl was smaller than a dog dish and they had only poured in a couple tablespoons of alcohol. Afterwards, the man instructed my dad to keep an egg, just out of the carton, not boiled or anything, in a small plate under their bed, my parents, for 3 days. On the 3rd day, before sunrise, my dad had to take it to a place where no one in my family would ever go again. The man said that he should leave it in a corner, turn around, and that no matter what he heard, he should not turn around. My dad did so. On the 3rd day he chose an alleyway in the part of the city he knew none of his family ever had any reason to go to. He put the plate on the ground, turned around, and walked away. He said he heard people whispering to him. There had been no one in the alley. This makes no sense. No sense at all. The only reason this keeps me up at night is because both him and my mom tell this story and I know they're not making it up. They don't play those kinds of games. You're welcome, Reddit. My grandmother, deceased, was from Mexico. Pieced together from a weird memory and different parts each of my parents witnessed, it still doesn't make sense. Your story reminds me of it though. So basically my whole life my grandmother always treated me very badly. I remember she and I were out in my parents' front yard and a neighbor said something about how cute I looked. Next thing I remember my mother walk in the front door. Her story picks up there. She said my grandmother had a bowl of eggs on the floor in front of where I was sitting. She was calling me evil. I guess she either had broken an egg on my head or tried to. My mom flipped shit and ended that nonsense right there. My dad gets home from work a while later and grandmother is waiting in the driveway for him. From what my dad says happened, grandmother said there was evil inside of me. She had broken 2 different eggs from the bowl after my mom told her to kick rocks. Both eggs either had double yolks or were bad, I don't remember exactly, but it involved both. My dad got her on a plane back to her place within the next few days. I only visited her after that. She always treated me like shit. Many years later when I was around 25 I went to visit as my aunts thought she would be passing soon. She had trauma-induced Alzheimer's from beatings her husband delivered. So I visit. She had stopped speaking English about 5 years earlier so we had no real way to communicate. She was calm and pleasant for a while till I went to sit by her. She got loud and put her hands on me. Like dug her nails in my arm. My dad and aunts said she was calling me white devil. But not to worry about it because in the last few years she had become very racist. My great-grandmother lived in a very old, early 19th century house in the 1960s. Her and her husband had a cat, called Wong. Wong was a huge, angry, ginger tomcat who wasn't afraid of anything. He would chase the dogs around and bite them, and all the neighborhood animals ran when they saw him. In the house, there was an old attic that was full of old clutter and rarely used. When they visited, the grandkids, my mum and her cousins, were all creeped out by the room, but would dare each other to go in there. The real problem, though, was the cat. When they tried to take him up there, he'd sit on the doorstep and refuse to go any further. If you carried him in, he'd bite, scratch and flee down the stairs. Because of Wong's reaction, everyone thought the attic was haunted. Wong disappeared some years later. It is a bit of a family legend that he was kidnapped and turned into a hat, but he was probably just run over. Probably. This one happened to my dad when he was in his late teens/early 20s. He is from a small town in Mexico and he and his cousin walked to a town about 5 miles away. Well, once in the neighboring town, they made their way to the local watering hole. They were having such a good time, they didn't realize it was already late. So, they leave but it's already 11 p.m. Dreading the long walk back, they see a horse that is tied to a tree. "Look, we have our taxi," my dad says. Both of them get on the bareback horse, with my dad's cousin in the front and my dad in the back. My dad and his cousin are euphoric. They are singing and just giddy that they found a horse to ride. They figure that once they get to their town, they'll just chew the horse away and it will find its way back to its owner. So they are having the time of their lives when all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, this huge dog runs up to them. It is growling and barking and the worst part is that it is trying to knock both my dad and his cousin off the horse. Then it goes back to try to bite them. All the while the horse is spooked and it is jumping up on its legs. Well, in those days, everybody carried a handgun. My dad and his cousin were no different. Probably dealing with a rabid dog. So my dad takes out his gun and point blank shoots the dog in the head. At this point my dad knew he hit the dog as he saw it hit the head, but the dog just shook it off and continued to lunge at them. At this point, Dad is thinking, well, it's a rabid dog so I must shoot until he can't possibly get up anymore. So he empties his 6-shooter on the dog. Same thing, dog just shakes it off. My dad then unholsters his cousin's gun and fires all the bullets into the dog. Same thing. Dog becomes even more vicious. At this point, my dad says that he felt such a chill going through his body. They take off on the horse while the dog was chasing them. Finally, they see that the dog is being outrun and is staying further and further back. Once they reach the entrance of our village, no sign of the dog so they dismount and shoo the horse back. They both run to their houses, no longer being drunk. The next day, they both decide to check the area where the dog appeared. They could not find any traces of blood whatsoever. My mom woke up to the phone ringing one night when we were out at our cottage in the middle of nowhere, Nova Scotia. You know that state of being half awake where you take a few moments to process anything and you're not sure if you're in a dream? That's how she described what was happening. She picked it up and heard no dial tone, only the continued ringing of the phone before she realized it wasn't ringing in the regular pattern of long short, more like a completely irregular sequence of half rings. This happened a couple times before she had woken up enough to sit up in bed and notice that what she thought was daylight outside was actually a sky so solidly bright purple it was luminescent, accompanied by a sound that she could only, half laughing, describe as the noise the TARDIS makes in Doctor Who. The electric radio clock next to the phone flashed something around 3:15 a.m., but it was clearly broken, as if the power had gone out despite the ringing phone, and needed to be reset. By this time my dad had also woken up and confirmed they both were seeing/hearing the same thing. The next morning there was no evidence of what happened except for both the radio and the landline phone in that room needing to be reset. No other appliances in the house were affected. Another story. From my grandmother on my father's side, my great-grandfather was dying in the hospital. And my grandmother came to visit. He was sleeping in the hospital bed, as my grandmother sat, gazing out the window, looking at the lights of the city down below, 6th floor in a Chicago hospital. All of a sudden the window went black. As what she describes, as a shadowed figure blocked out the street lights below. At this very moment my great-grandfather sat straight up in bed and pointed towards the window screaming "Hess here, to take me." He died about an hour later, scared the shit out of my grandmother. We used to live around the corner from Ivan Milat, the backpacker killer. My parents used to walk past his house all the time and were always creeped out. He was a creepy-looking guy and he'd always be out the front of his house, waving and staring. I don't think they ever talked to him, but when he was arrested and they found all the guns and stuff in his walls and floor, my mom wasn't surprised. My cousin dated his nephew, who had a weird obsession with his uncle, and killed my cousin's friend trying to one-up Ivan. I have a follower. I've always been very sensitive to the afterlife, if that's how you would put it. Creepy and spooky things are drawn to me. We always talk about spooky things with my family and my aunt's family. Couple of stories: the house I grew up in was horribly haunted. There was an old lady who lived in the basement, behind the furnace. She was really old and wore a funny old-timey dress with a babushka and a cane. She would just walk around or stand behind the couch when you watched TV down there. There was also the hockey sticks. My dad would put our hockey sticks in the rafters in the basement. They were supported by several beams, and wedged in. There was no possible way for them to move unless you pulled them down physically. We would regularly find them on the ground fallen down. Dad would wedge them in good and they would still be knocked down. My sister's ex-boyfriend was very sensitive to this stuff too and confirms my old lady, he's seen her too. Christmas morning was always a bunch of activity. We would go out into the garage for a smoke and there was always something strange that would happen. A big gust of wind, it's totally still outside, no wind, would come through the garage with all the doors closed. Things would fall off the workbench. It was always things my papa used to own. You could feel his presence every Christmas morning. It was kind of sweet. We started replying to his little hellos and you could just feel him around you. They were hall walkers. I lived on the main floor beside my parents' room. The hall was carpeted. Every night just after everyone was in bed you could hear a pair of people shuffling their feet down the hall on the carpet and mumbling to each other. They once entered my room and it scared the shit out of me. Just large black figures. I started screaming and they went away. Now the kicker, I see people all the time. I'll catch a glimpse or mistake them for real people sometimes. Which has never bugged me too much until a few years ago. I had just moved into a small apartment by myself for the first time. I'd always had roommates before. My window faced the road and a bus stop. For the first few weeks I noticed a hooded male figure standing by the bus stop in the evenings staring up at my window. I finally worked up the courage to go out there and yell at him. I got down the stairs, he's gone. Less than 30 seconds later I'm back upstairs and he's there. There's no place to hide where he was, so I should have seen him when I went downstairs. I ran back down and he's gone and I get back and he's there, etc. This is when I realized he's not an actual person. Then I started seeing him follow me around other places, work, my mom's, anywhere really. And H kept getting closer and closer to me. I started seeing him in the back seat of my car in the rearview mirror and I would try and talk to him. He never responded, and it didn't feel like a malicious spirit. So I moved again a year later into a small house. I was taking a shower in the AM and my boyfriend at the time would stay over a lot and we would shower together. All of a sudden I feel someone's hand run through my hair and down my neck. I thought, oh, it's just boyfriend, until I realized I was home alone and he had not stayed over. I felt this thing's presence and freaked out. He's still around but a lot less. He keeps his distance and mostly just hangs around. I once made the mistake of going to the doctor thinking I was going insane. Big mistake. It sounds insane, but considering the amount of paranormal experiences I've had with these type of beings, it doesn't seem so strange to me anymore. I no longer feel like I'm insane. Me and my siblings always talk about a UFO we all saw one summer night while stargazing on our trampoline. The youngest sibling was 6, and the oldest was 12. My sister actually brought it up again about 5 years ago, and explained in great detail what the UFO actually looked like. It was exactly the same as what my memory of it was. Further discussions with my other siblings proved that we all saw exactly the same thing, including minor details. I have 5 siblings, and we all saw the same thing regardless of what age we were at the time. Now it's always brought up, often laid into our family gatherings. I usually end up telling the story I had of being stalked by mountain lions in Colorado and how they almost killed and ate my friend who ran ahead of us. 3 of us were finishing up a 20-mile hike, 2 of us were back further and our other friend ran ahead to warm up the car. I stayed back with our other friend who was a little slower and tired. Basically it was dark by the end of our hike and I peered my headlamp off into the grass and about 50 feet away I saw its glowing eyes staring at me. I kept my light on it and began to yell at it until I saw the eyes disappear. Then another 20 minutes go by and I hear my friend ahead of us yelling, so I yelled back. When I find him, he's sitting on the side of the trail shaking and wet. His headlamp died and he lost the trail somewhere around the river crossing, and once he found the trail again he decided to just wait for us. While he was waiting he could hear the mountain lion stalking him and he could hear it about 15 feet away from him moving closer and closer, but couldn't see anything. He said he heard it take off running as soon as he heard me yell back at him. We came to the conclusion there were two of them and they had probably been stalking us together ever since the sun set. Pretty freaky experience knowing you're being stalked by an animal that you know is intending to kill you. You just have to hope they are either not hungry and desperate enough, or they think you're stronger than you really are. Mom used to get beaten by her ex-husband, not my father. They lived in a house where the former owner was found hanging from a banister. One night after a particularly bad beating, apparently my mom's husband woke up and saw this woman at the end of the bed, shaking her head and put her finger up as to say no more. This may get buried, but hey, what ifs. There's one story I've heard that happened with my granny, Mom's mom, and it always creeped me out. This took place around 1917 or 1918, not sure exactly how old Granny was. Anyway, they lived in the mountains on a big farm and she went with her father one day to the mill to get their corn ground up. They left at dawn to be the first one there. Total round trip and all would take about 7 hours. They rounded a curve in the road and saw a farmhouse. I assume it had been empty for a while and her dad frequently passed it to get to the mill in town. He made the comment that they must have had new neighbors since a woman stood on the porch waving and gesturing for them to come to the house. Her dad said they couldn't stop, they had to be first at the mill, so they waved and continued on. On the way home in the afternoon he commented that if he sees the woman then he'd stop on by and say hello. As they rode up everything had changed. The house was in shambles, the garden dead and weeds everywhere, complete opposite of how it looked hours before. Granny swore she saw this woman, that she took her apron and wiped her brow, that she waved and gestured. There was no way even I could think possible for a beautiful farmhouse with lush gardens to be worn down with dead bushes in 7 hours. Unfortunately I never heard this from her, just from my mom. But apparently Granny always wondered what would have happened if they had gone inside. It just creeps me out to even imagine it. This isn't the only creepy story, but it's one I always think about. My grandmother has 8 children, and every holiday or family dinner, she and my aunts and uncles chime in about a series of supposedly paranormal events that occurred in their home from around 1970 onward. They include everything from drawers opening and closing to footsteps on the stairs, to an aunt getting locked in the basement and having to exit the house through the storm cellar door, to another aunt being yanked out of bed by her feet. The most common story, however, told in some variation by Grandma and all 8 siblings, however, is about the hooded man. His appearance was signaled by orbs, little balls of light, flitting around the room, and then, he would, as I've been told, appear at the foots of beds or the corners of rooms at night and just stand there. My own mother woke up one night to something hovering over her bed. It scared her so badly she slept with her sisters for about a week. The single most often repeated tale, however, involves a friend of my uncle's who slept over the house in high school. He woke my uncle up in the middle of the night, said he had to go home, and then pretty much rushed out and walked all the way there alone in the wee hours of the morning. He did not offer an explanation until Monday at school, where he told my uncle he woke up and saw a person on the ceiling looking down at him. And he never went back to my family's home after that. Now, I've never had anything strange happen there. I should note, however, that they did bring in a priest in 1996 to bless the place for this exact purpose, however much belief you're willing to lend it. What's interesting is that in the early 2000s, an aunt of mine moved back into the house with my grandmother with her young daughter, my cousin. When she was about 4 or 5, my cousin started bringing up a shadow man who would come see her at night. It ended pretty quickly, and she hasn't mentioned it in a long time, nor does she remember it today. My mom used to have this big Snoopy-like plush toy size of a small kid. They're ones you get in a state fair kinda thing. I had it as long as I can remember and could have been older than me. Love that plush to death. Beck is a 5-year-old. It serves as a couch for me. My cousins however hated that toy. They say its eyes were unnerving. Every summer my cousins stay over at our house for the break. Up till 5-ish I sometimes sleep at my old crib that can be converted into a small day bed. My cousins would sneak in at night and lay next to me, sometimes 3 of us crammed into the crib, but would not do so if that plush toy was in the crib. Well, too bad for them, the crib was actually my Snoopy's home. One evening my cousin came out running from the bedroom. They were crying. They told me and our parents that the plush toy was moving, the eyes were red and there was blood on the side of its mouth. I didn't believe them as I never felt anything eerie about the toy itself. But my cousins year after year would share experiences they had with the toy. When I became a teenager, the plush outlived its purpose and was eventually thrown or given away. I just came home to it gone one day. The funny thing is, I never had a bad exp with the toy. In fact, I loved sleeping next to it. Made me feel safe. The house itself, however, well, that's another story of haunted experiences. I once told my cousin Derek about my curiosity of playing with a Ouija board. Derek then told me that wouldn't be a good idea. The story goes him and his buddy Ira were playing with one in the basement during a family party and they started to ask how old the spirit was and was thousands of years old. They asked a few more questions and eventually asked, "What do you look like?" Now Ira was a really good artist and what happened next Derek couldn't really explain. He said Ira instantly grabbed a piece of paper and pen and his eyes flipped to the back of his head and started scribbling on the paper and eventually drew a demonic figure that had a huge eye. Once Ira snapped out of it, he asked, "What happened?" Derek was stunned and told him that he drew that, and they ran upstairs to show family the piece of paper and what happened. They didn't believe them and told them to go back downstairs. The spirit then told them on the Ouija board what each person upstairs looks like by seeing them through the piece of paper. They stopped playing the game immediately. Derek never played again, but supposedly another cousin did and hasn't been the same since. Family say she got caught up on hard drugs and alcohol, but my cousin thinks something happened when she played. I see Derek quite often. My other cousin I don't. She's kind of standoffish and out of respect I haven't asked her what happened since I'm not close with her. My dad would always tell me about my aunt's husband, now deceased. My dad was a young boy when he knew his sister's husband, but he remembers him clearly, and from the stories I've been told he was a man that wasn't afraid of anything. This man was shot, mugged, his face was practically burned off and he still walked to his home with the fresh burns on his face. Mind you, this all happened on different occasions. One story that freaked me the hell out was when my aunt's husband was pissed drunk one night. My aunt and her husband live down south in Mexico, and where they're from they are almost at the border of the forest. So there are a lot of trails and you can keep walking for miles and miles. I can't remember if he was coming back from a party or what he was doing. He was a big drinker. Anyways, he was on his way home and he was on his horse. He wasn't navigating the horse at all. He couldn't. He was so drunk. He didn't even know where he was going. Well, he fell asleep on top of the horse, and once he woke up, he was still drunk, but he realized the horse wasn't walking anymore. Something was carrying the horse with him on top. He didn't freak out or try to get off the horse. He just fell back to sleep. When he woke up, he was on top of a mountain miles away from home. He told my aunt what happened to him, but by then she was so used to what would happen to him it didn't faze her at all. He would leave for days and just pop out of nowhere again. Many other unexplained things happened to him, but that one that makes me shiver every time I hear it. My brother's family used to always talk about the face on the wall. When one of the oldest members of their family passed away, can't recall if it was a grandfather or great-grandfather, an angry-looking shadow face suddenly appeared on the wall in the living room of their family's house. It never faded away. I've never gone to said house, and I'm pretty sure it's not in the family anymore, but the story stuck with me every time they told it. My mom swears to us all that her grandpa had a haunted mirror that would shake randomly all the time, even at different houses over the years in different regions. Also, my aunt claims to have been accosted by a troll/fairy/goblin/gnome when she was a girl. She said it followed her to the bus stop a few times, and the last time it charged her in an evil way until she hopped on the bus. My grandpa used to be into the occult. He performed rituals for people who needed solutions or answers for their everyday problems. Mom says this one time, a couple came in with their blind 5-year-old. They wanted to know why their son had been born blind. My grandpa consulted with who/whatever he talked to during his sessions, and found out the kid was the latest reincarnation of the Roman Emperor Nero, and that he had reincarnated as a blind person ever since, who knows how many times, as punishment for his actions in ancient Rome. Not sure if creepy or scary, but definitely unexplained. I usually just creep on here, but I got one. Admittedly though, there's a great chance it's not true. This comes from my uncle, who is an unrepentant bullshitter, so put some salt with this shit. The story, according to my uncle, his grandfather, my great-grandpa, was a member of the mafia. He was a gin runner during Prohibition, running between South Carolina and Virginia. Uncle always tells how he was a mean-ass old man. My mother confirmed that part. From my uncle's story, in order to join the mafia he had to be without family. Since he had a wife and kid in Virginia, he decided to take them to a cave and murder them. That's apparently how he joined the mafia. I have done a slight bit of research and have never found any references to the mafia requiring this of their members. Or maybe it was his decision entirely, I don't know. Anyways, he ran booze for the mafia for an unknown number of years after this. Eventually he married again, my great-grandmother, and had my mom and her brothers and sisters. I just think it's a little creepy with the idea that, maybe, there is a cave in Virginia with the bodies of a woman and kid buried in it. My dad was staying at a place in his youth, and he was all alone except for his dog, who was in the room with him. There were no people in the area, and yet his bedroom door slowly opened itself. The handle was turning. It wasn't as if he just forgot to latch it or something. When it opened, there was nothing on the other side. The dog was terrified. It's not always brought in gatherings, but my mom has told this story a couple of times. When I was in high school, my grandmother on my father's side died. The first or second day of the wake I wasn't able to be there as I had a field trip, but I immediately went straight to the wake after the trip. After a few days, my mother came in. For context, my parents are separated, to visit, and she said that my grandmother visited her the day prior. She said that while she was at home watching Oprah, she went to the pantry to finish up some stuff before getting ready for work. As she was in the pantry, she suddenly heard the volume go down and heard static that TVs made when switching channels. After a few seconds, the volume went up again and my mom realized that the TV was already on a local movies channel. It was creepy because it was the channel that my grandmother usually watched before. Being no stranger to these kinds of things, my mom just let my grandmother watch for a bit before turning the TV off and got ready for work. My mom made it a point to visit the next day. No, he just sort of disappears if I try to keep talking to him. He's never made any kind of indication that he's heard me. He just hangs around mostly. Like I said, he or it I guess doesn't seem to want to cause me any harm aside from freaking me out a bit. Ha, others just look and sound like normal people, but wisp why, if that makes sense. They're usually people from a different period of time, or look like they are, but some are just normal pass on the street people. I can't say I've been able to make contact with many, but some will speak in passing. If I have been able to hear them or make contact, they have a voice that is kind of light and airy and trails off on. I don't know how to explain it. I have very rarely encountered one that seemed malicious or wanting to cause harm. I'll be honest, most of the time it scares the daylights out of me, and the ones that I might have a negative vibe about I will remove myself as fast as I can. Mostly cause I'm scared, but also for the off chance it does have malicious intent. Otherwise it's kinda cool. It also adds a super fun scare factor to all my friends and family who know about it. If I see someone, I'll just stop dead in my tracks and watch or backtrack to where I saw it and stare and search for it a bit. They all know what I'm doing and it gives them the heebie-jeebies. My great-grandparents on my mother's side had a table. It was their dining room table. All of the kids would gather at the table to play games and whatnot. When all of their hands were on the table would dance. They said it would actually lift off the ground, about 6 inches or so, and wobble back and forth, as if it were dancing. When my great-grandfather, who was a no-nonsense type of guy, would place his hand on the table, it would drop to the floor. I have no idea what happened to the table. Would be cool to have it today. My uncle drank bleach. He is still alive and healthy. Every time I ask family members about more details, I get nothing but chuckles and nobody knows more details, except that it was by accident and he is extremely embarrassed about it. I never asked him about this because it feels so awkward, so I guess it remains a mystery. Super late, but this is a story my deceased grandmother used to tell our family. My grandmother and her sister, my grandma as well, still alive, were young when this happened. They lived in a cabin/shack in Mexico surrounded by cornfield. If they wanted to go to the restroom, they would have to go outside to another little shack. Well, one night they wanted to go outside to use the restroom, but they started hearing weird noises coming from outside and rushed back into their house. They looked outside their window and saw the cornfield moving. From the cornfield emerged a bear standing on its hind legs, walking out. This is a weird part. They seemed to see his eyes popping in and out of its sockets, making strange noises. My family often says that they are shapeshifters called naguales. I have more stories told by my deceased grandmother if anyone is interested. The first ever encounter/ghost sighting I've ever had was indeed with a family/friends gathering at my cousin's house. I was about 14. I had just moved in with my cousin up here in the mountains. Before I moved up here for my birthday, I was gifted a brand new electric scooter which I cherished. I brought it to his house when we moved in, and on this particular day my cousin, our friend and myself were all taking turns on my electric scooter driving up and down the dirt road. It was just at the end of the day where the sun was passing beyond the mountains, and for the most part it was dark. I remember when we would take turns riding my scooter, all you could see was the little red light as they would go down the street. My cousin had just finished his couple laps riding around and came back to let our friend take a turn. We stood there talking, watching that little red light go down the street. Mind you, my cousin's mother was right behind us, just minding her own business but watching him also ride the scooter. As we are focusing on him coming back, he out of nowhere drops my scooter straight to the ground and bolts past us, running into the house. I start walking up to my scooter to pick it up, and from the left side of me I hear my aunt and my cousin yell, "Oh, my God, what is that?" and look at them and notice they are pointing across the street. I glance over and I see this little boy. I can remember it so well, and I can't help but have the image ingrained into my memory. I remember he was a young boy, between 3 to 5, riding a tricycle. I swear I've never felt so frozen and shocked in my life. He was sort of looking at us as we were looking at him, as if he noticed us watching him. During all of this I can still hear my cousin and my aunt still saying things like, "Oh my God, and do you see this?" Eventually he continued on and kept going until he faded into a house across the street. After that moment all 4 of us talked and confirmed we all saw the exact same thing. Afterwards we actually went to our neighbor's house and asked if they saw anything go into their house. They looked confused and said no, and after all 4 of us explained and after even hearing it from an adult, they allowed us to come in and look around the house in the area that we saw this apparition fade into it. But nothing. Even to this day, whenever we bring up the experience, it's like the same story will come out of everyone's mouth. Even when I type this story my eyes slightly water and I get chills. That experience alone has convinced me that there is a reality beyond the one we see on a day-to-day basis. No matter what science says or what people try to say, it's just something I will never forget and I will always believe. Every time I see these posts I always wish I had something to add, and then totally remember I do. The stories that fit the actual post title though are more or less little ones. My auntie is never actually the one who mentions this first one, despite it being about her, but everyone else has no problem telling it. I think it's mainly because she's just so indifferent and casual about it. It simply happened to her and that's just the way it is. Although she is this tough as nails, shaven-headed tattooed ambulance driver, so she doesn't get fazed by much. Apparently throughout all of her pregnancies, 3, she saw ghosts, clear as day, who just stood around in her house. The figure mentioned most is an old man, who would stand at the bottom of their stairs and just constantly stare up. The thing is though, she could only see him from downstairs. So if she was walking down from the 2nd floor he would not be there, but after she would pass the point he stood by and looked back, he would be there. Apparently, as she would always explain in an irritated manner, they have a very narrow house, meaning a very narrow hallway. This is London suburban we're talking about. She would literally just have to walk through him to get upstairs. The second, creepier one, is about my grandmother. Again, I don't think I've ever actually heard her tell this story, but all her children have mentioned it. Her and her husband decided to do a trip of some kind with another married couple who were 2 of their closest friends. I can't recall where because I haven't heard this story in a little while, but I know it was this big old mansion that you could visit and rent rooms like B&B in. My grandparents were given a room on the bottom floor while their friends were given one on the 2nd floor. After everyone had gone to bed, my grandmother is trying to fall asleep when all of a sudden the door handle, so we're talking actual door handle, one of the ones that you push down, so not a doorknob that you twist, starts being furiously pushed up and down, repeatedly, like you would to open the door, but the door never opens. It just remains closed with the handle beating up and down really fast and aggressively. I can't remember if the door is locked, but they were old when this happened, And being in a random B&B, it's possible. Instantly my grandmother assumes it's their friend, the husband of the couple they came with, because being a childish old man he is a bit of a prankster. And it stops after a few seconds, so she shakes her head and just continues trying to go to sleep, and then minutes later it happens again. This handle just starts being pushed sporadically. So aggressively that it's loud enough to wake my grandfather. This time, in typical British fashion, they literally just shout at the friend they think is doing it to get off. And that would be fine, but it literally goes on for hours, every now and then, just that intensely. They meet their friends the next morning and are naturally annoyed and pissed at them. But their friends remain clueless and more so shocked, and the husband swears he didn't go near their door. To be fair, I don't remember a part of the story where my grandparents simply went and opened the door, which I agree doesn't make sense, cause obviously if you though it was your friend you would just go tell him to piss off. It's possible that it was happening far enough apart that every time it happened they thought it would be the last time, or maybe they were genuinely scared, and more just hoped it was their friend pulling a prank. I got more but this is already super long. So, my parents grew up in Costa Rica, and they each have a few interesting tales to tell about strange events and things they've encountered there. Here's one that happened to my mom. Not really scary but still strange. Both my grandparents worked full-time to make ends meet, so it was usually my mom taking care of her 4 younger siblings, but it wasn't unusual for even low-income families back then to have a housekeeper or someone to generally help with the kids and chores. My mom had seen a few come and go over the years. One day she came home to find a new housekeeper, an older woman, already at work washing and hanging clothes in the yard. My mom says she used to be there whenever she and her siblings got home from school, and would be gone by the time her mother came home. She never spoke, just showed up and went about her business with the chores. My mom didn't think much of it. She said she even used to play little tricks on her, throwing hanging clothes on the ground, making messes after she had cleaned up, typical bratty kid stuff. This went on for weeks. Then, one day, just as randomly as she had appeared, she was gone. My mom assumed she quit because she was fed up with their pranks. Years went by. My mom was all grown up, and one day she was talking to my grandmother, reminiscing about her childhood days. She said, "Remember that old housekeeper lady you hired during my school year? We hated her, she was so weird, etc." Something to that effect. My grandmother just looked at her like she was crazy. What housekeeper? We didn't have any help in the house that whole year because money was tight. I counted on you to look after things at home. To this day my mother has no idea who that woman was or why she came to her family the way she did. She figures it was either a wandering spirit looking for work, or an angel who came to help them out when things were tough. I'll post more of my parents' stories. They may need to retell me a few so I don't get the details wrong. Some of them are really creepy. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.